Steven Tiell has some experience when it comes to AI ethics. This is not his first rodeo. His ability to explain things, his breadth of knowledge is fascinating. I had a wonderful time talking to him, and I asked him to introduce himself, give us a quick intro blurb, and he just was off to the races. So you'll hear that at the beginning, that it was straight to the point, no messing around. We only got an hour. We're going to talk about the most important stuff. So if you're new here and you're wondering what exactly this whole podcast, video cast is about, we are bringing on some of the best and the brightest minds when it comes to AI ethics and AI governance. And we're talking to them about the biggest issues that they see and how we can create best practices as we move forward. You'll see that in this conversation, Steven has thought long and hard about these best practices. And he actually joined us in our Slack community, which I encourage everyone to jump into if you have not already. It is a wonderful and open community where we are talking about everything that has to do with AI ethics and related technologies. You can find the links below. The last thing I will mention is that we have an incredible sponsor. Without them, we would not be here today. So I have to say thank you to EthicsGrade. They are an AI benchmarking firm. AI ethics benchmarking firm. Don't forget that ethics part. That's the important one. EthicsGrade, if you want to know more about them, you can check the link below. And now let's just jump into it with Steven. You'll hear he's off to the races. What does he have to say? Here we go.
Are you a robot?
I'm Steven Tiell. I lead responsible innovation at Accenture, and this is something that we started as a research initiative, really as part of the research for the 2014 technology vision. And what we uncovered during that process, a foresight process where we go from kind of what I call topics, which is 30 to 40 kind of point source things, might be mobile, IoT, cloud, those types of things, which we then assemble into themes. And so we take 3 or 4 of those topics, assemble them into themes, and then we tell stories about those. So the themes are both logical and random. So we'll pick things out of a box and put them together, and then we tell stories. And sometimes those stories are kind of silly, and sometimes those stories are very realistic. And sometimes those stories, get a little scary. And so the stories are both kind of utopian or realistic, and then dystopian. If things go wrong, what does this look like? And that year, about 80% of those stories took the form of, holy geez, we're going to be able to do some really interesting things with technology. And just because we can really doesn't mean we should. And what do we do about that? And more importantly, how do we advise clients around that? Because, really our mandate as a lab is to look at things that our clients will care about in the next 1 to 2 years. My particular team is looking at foresight that's really 3 to 5 years out. And sometimes we extend that a little bit to kind of have a peek around the corner. And so all of these stories were really, kind of 3 to 5 years out. And that was the time horizon where we felt, if we could do something in the next couple of years, we could actually affect this when it becomes important. And I ended up building a team of about 20 external luminaries. The first person was a cyborg anthropologist, which is a really cool thing. And then we ended up adding like German privacy lawyers. We had a woman who works on war crimes data for the UN. She's one of 10 people in the world with access to this data, because if it got out, it means genocide and very deep harms. And so it was really interesting as we look at, kind of how can this go wrong and what ends up happening. And we really wanted to be able to affect some kind of advice and change in that space. And we ended up publishing a handful of papers in 2016. They were largely picked up by, I'd say, middle management layers, so managers, directors of data science, software engineering teams. And that's really not my core audience that I'm after, right? I want to talk to C-suite and direct reports and influence their thinking. And so my leadership, after a few years of this, was starting to say, okay, maybe we should look somewhere else. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of interest there. And then Cambridge Analytica happened. And all of a sudden, I started having incomings, initially from general counsels and then boards of directors. And I think they told senior executives to do something about it. And so, then they started calling. And since that time, I've had the pleasure of working with dozens of companies across 9 different industries. And it's just been, a fascinating and fun journey.
Can you tell us a few stories
Oh,
that
wow.
you created?
Yeah. The trouble with the stories is that nobody will allow us to really talk about it. So I can talk about some things in general that have been really interesting. I think, one of the first things that really had me scratching my head, I heard that one of the world's largest advertisers was interested. And I'm just trying to think of, how does that work really? And it turned out, their question was, should we even be advertising on social networks during global election cycles due to brand safety concerns, right? We don't want our valuable brands to be showing up next to mis and disinformation because that erodes trust in what we try to do. And so what do we do about that? I think that was one of the more interesting ones. Another one that was kind
Yeah,
of
that makes sense.
interesting as well was a smart cities player, right? And so their interest was essentially, look, we have a chief of police in a city that is saying, we're in court. We have we can see from camera footage from the smart cities company puts different types of sensors and boxes on light poles, and so those might be video surveillance, right? And so they have footage of a car pulling up, a man getting out, and a couple minutes later, the man getting in with a little girl. And the guy says, I've had a relationship with this girl her whole life, nothing to see here, move along. Mom says girl was extracted through a ground floor window, and this is a kidnapping.
Oh, wow.
And chief of police says, hey, if I had UAVs flying overhead, I'd have this footage. Hey, company, why don't you give this footage to me? And the company says, look, we put our stuff on light posts. We disable any pixels over private property by default. We have no interest in spying in bedrooms and that kind of thing, right? The right response. And the chief of police says, well, figure it out. I understand you don't have it for this one, but we're going to have this situation or something similar again, and you need to figure it out in that time. And the company says, well, what do I do about that, right?
Yeah.
And
What do they do about that?
in another city, the mayor, that we have shot spotter microphones in these, boxes as well. And the mayor wants to use that audio to really get a word cloud of what the residents is on their
Oh,
minds, right? What
no.
are they thinking about day to day? So when I come into the office in the morning, I want a word cloud sitting at my desk. How
That
could that
sounds
go wrong,
horrible.
right?
Yeah. No
And so,
way.
the answer to so then the question really becomes, okay, well, what happens when, say a Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, wants this system and they want the 5 features that all these cities have, and then they start using the system to persecute dissidents.
Yeah.
Right now, the
Yeah.
residents in the cities, elsewhere find out like, hey, wait a minute, we have the same system installed that Riyadh is using to persecute dissidents. Get that out of my city, right?
Yeah.
And there's no mayor on the planet that's not going to respect that because they want to get reelected. And so, we have existential risk on our hands. And so how do we deal with that, right? And so this is really interesting, this story, because the answer to it is really you go to market with your values. Right.
Mm.
This is not where I expected this work to go when we started looking at it in 2013, 2014. And it's really something that has come full circle. Back then, if you had told me, oh, Steven, you're going to be working on culture change, I would have said, you got the wrong guy.
Uh-huh.
But that's where really, kind of the highest instantiation of this work goes is toward culture change. So the answer for this company is basically you go to market with your values. You tell the mayors, look, this is what you're buying. This is where, we will not compromise on these things. You will not be able to get footage of private property ever. And we're giving you this guarantee, just as we're giving every other municipality that we work with this guarantee. And we will not erode these values. And you can be assured that these valuable tools that you're using to manage your city will not go away because we're doing this correctly.
And so do you feel like in that situation that you spoke about where a girl was potentially abducted, would that be a good use case to actually have the spying and break that hardline stance? I mean, it seems like you would want to know that, but then it's just a slippery slope from there, right?
That's exactly
So
right.
so is it all or nothing, or is there some leeway? I mean, it sounds to me like it's all or nothing.
In certain situations, it's more binary, I think. But overall, we see a number of kind of tenets coming through, and one of those is increasing agency for those that are involved, right? For those who are subjected to the AIs. In some situations, certainly with surveillance situations, that's not necessarily an option.
Mm,
Um, and then it comes down really to governance, right? How are we governing this? How are we saying what's okay and what's not okay, and under what context? How are we reviewing that, right? So if we look at it kind of more broadly, and we say, okay, well, you heard me mention values before and how you go to market with your values. So
yeah.
really, those values are what that they indicate what stakeholders care about, what they want to protect, what they want to promote, right? And then we look at principles. And those are really the norms or rules that describe how to implement the values. They describe in general what order is required, and this can be ethically, legally, according to your own, your organization's own value structure. And what do you want to protect and promote, or how do you want to use those principles to protect and promote those basic values? Um, and then it's really the job of governance to assess whether those norms are satisfied in a particular case, like, maybe with respect to a new decision-making procedure, a new technology, a new organizational policy. It could be, any number of things. And then ethics is actually that work that's performed to satisfy the values in accordance with the principles and in support of governance. And I think,
Mm.
as those are themes that we see kind of, riddled throughout most of the engagements that we look at.
So speaking of which, like I read a lot of your work on creating a committee and an ethics committee inside of companies. And like you said, it seems like Cambridge Analytica was great for business, and it ended up making people aware of the need for this, right? And so I'd just love to dive into that a little bit. Like, what needs to be in place to create this committee, and does it need to be internal, external, a little bit of both? How do you see that? And because I know you have some best practices for that.
Yeah, and the thing is that one size does not fit all, right?
Mm,
One of the common things that I hear is, we don't want bloated bureaucratic governance, right? We want essential governance. We want just the minimum that we need to not create a lot of friction, but then still have this control over what gets shipped.
yeah.
Um, and I think that's really the key is in all of this work, how do we fit it into what already exists? I think there's a good example here. So one of the papers we published in 2016 was around like, what are the questions to ask along the data supply chain, right? Or the product development lifecycle. And so we looked at both ITIL's service delivery model and Project Management Institute's best practices. And we lined up kind of the life cycle management process. We said, okay, where are pre and post mortems? Where can we inject these questions into the process, right? And what we found is that really doesn't get the job done, because what ends up happening, unless you have an applied ethicist in the room leading the conversation, those conversations get very circular and it
Uh-huh.
doesn't really yield a result. And so, we came up with this other thing with a number of other collaborators as well that we call ethical spectrums. And ethical spectrums looks at kind of, we want to, again, it's looking at this idea of how do you provide agency for those that are directly involved. And so the spectrum might look like something, on one end you might say, it's what is a business status quo? And at the other end, it's really, what is an ethically higher bar? And what example of this is model for an aggregate population over an individual, right? Currently, the status quo is I want to market to the party of one. I want to know a lot about you, and I want to know enough so that I can give you a message that will resonate with you. But the fact of the matter is that you don't have a million unique users or individuals who you're servicing. You have a million people who might fit into a dozen different personas or a
Mhm.
couple dozen different personas, right? And this is a lot easier problem to solve for like marketing, for instance. It's a lot easier to operationalize, and it's actually an engineering harder problem, which engineers gravitate toward, right? They love hard problems. And so you give them the agency to make that decision based upon a generalized framework that says, oh, here's maybe 10 things that you should be, 10 spectrums you should be looking at. Another thing that Kathy Baxter at Salesforce kind of started doing was putting in, in agile processes, your definition of ready and definition of done. And kind of, your definition of ready, you're saying, oh, well, how might this be weaponized? Right? Have some foresight as to, how could things go wrong? And then on the definition of done, we want to reflect on that. What was done to address these things that you identified earlier? And then what did you discover along the way? So if we come back and make a version 2.0, what are the things that we should be paying attention to maybe in that next version, right? And so these
That's
are all
brilliant.
kinds of like controls that fit into processes that happen already and can be adopted and whatnot.
And so, why do you think you mentioned Salesforce? And I read how you spoke about Salesforce in a very, um, very good light, we could say.
Mhm.
And why do you think that some companies are able to execute like Salesforce and they're able to bring ethics into their DNA? I actually just this week was speaking to Anne, and she works at IBM. And it's another one of those companies where it feels like ethics is ingrained in them, and then other companies, it's just the wild, wild west. And there's no thought of ethics. Or if they do think about ethics, it's as an afterthought when shit hits the fan.
It's interesting. I think that there are leaders who get it, and there are leaders who don't get it, and maybe a third class of those who don't get it and never will. Have no desire
That's
to get it.
inspiring.
Um,
Yeah.
hopefully, those are less and less. But I think that Salesforce is certainly one of those organizations that gets it. Right? They were the first to have a C-level role to address these things. Um, and there's a lot of opportunity for those who get it to really embed it into their operations and into what they do. And I think that those who do get it also understand that this is something that builds trust. And in a world that is increasingly focused on, what can we prove? We see a lot of the younger generation using YouTube as a primary search engine because, when you ask them why, they say, well, if I see it, I know it's
Yeah.
real.
Uh,
So this kind of fake news, alternative facts environment that we're in, we have a really difficult time, assessing what's real, and I think that's a primary driver as well.
yeah. And speaking of which, I'm just going to bounce around here a little
Yeah.
bit. I watched your panel on deepfakes,
Oh.
and I thought that that is something really interesting too, because as you're talking about us, our generation using YouTube so much, and more and more the younger generations, they want to see it so they know it's real. I mean, deepfakes is going to totally destroy that whole rationale, or it already has potentially, right? So when you look at deepfakes, do you feel there needs to be more regulation? I thought the panel was it was really well said when a few talked about how to try and curtail it so it's not like it doesn't explode in our face, but it seems like it's here to stay. So how do you foresee this as you look ahead in the future?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and it's one of many challenges. I think that. ultimately, where I would like to see it go to is kind of like a trusted data exchange, but this would be really a trusted media exchange, right? Where you have a platform where anybody can build a tool and post it to that platform. And that tool would look at, how do I authenticate the validity of this video or this audio, this picture, right? Media
Mm.
clip. Um, and maybe as I would like to see a future where when things are posted to social channels, even the news, that they first go to this system and you end up with a watermark that says the confidence that this video is original and unaltered is X.
Uh-huh.
Where we see technology, there's a company called TruePic that builds hardware devices for OEMs to integrate into their digital devices, the capture devices, whether it's an audio recorder, a SLR camera, you name it. And can I validate the at capture that this is original and unaltered, and how do I carry that metadata through, right? Adobe
Yeah.
has done something very similar where they allow creators to amend that metadata to transformations that they do within their software. And so it gives us another tool, another signal that this is a legitimate piece of media that we can trust. And I
Mm.
think ultimately that's what it comes to. And companies are realizing that in this environment where trust is difficult, it becomes a differentiator and it builds gravity toward brands. And those brands that garner trust are those that will be able to experience outside growth going forward. This is why
Mm.
Apple has had an ad campaign the last year and a half, 2 years that focuses on privacy.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have seen that a number of years ago, but it engenders trust.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning with the light posts that are looking at their surroundings, their surveillance on everything. It's a great way for them to market if they talk about how this is our hard line. We're not going to break this line, and so you can trust us on this one. Even if the sheriff comes knocking, we're not breaking that line. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about. I mean, I was actually surprised in the panel at one point. I can't remember if it was you, sorry, or if it was one of the members on the panel that said that the question was like, I would like to see deep fakes being used for good. And I was in a way, I was a little bit shocked by that because I thought, how can we use deep fakes for good? Besides just like random entertainment, because we get to see Obama rapping or something. But what can we do for good around deep fakes?
There's actually quite a bit, and I think this is movies, right? I mean, yes, entertainment, but this is one of the things where we're seeing more movement in the media industry toward digital creation, particularly during pandemic.
Mm.
And this is one of the reasons why the academic researchers who have been working on this space have published the work, because it is being used by that industry. And there are reasons to do it. We also have kind of inclusion and diversity reasons to do it that are somewhat compelling. I can't talk about those yet.
Mm.
But there are a number of things. I think voice is something that is certainly compelling as well, right? So we can look at real time. You can think of whistleblowers, and you've seen them on news programs where their voices changed, where they're in the darkness, right? And
Yeah.
that's not really a deep fake. That's kind of a category of so-called cheap fakes.
Yeah.
But it kind of gives you this notion of, yeah, there are reasons why we would want to use this technology, and it's not just for nefarious purposes.
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing that was brought up by one of the panelists was how deepfakes, just taking a step back and not looking at deepfakes themselves, but looking at the harm that they can cause to society is a bit, uh, it threatens our trust. And it goes back to that idea of trust again, like if we can't trust what we're seeing with our eyes, what can we trust? And so then you are able to have situations where people can say, "Oh, but that's fake news. That we can't trust that. That's not true." And so when there are things that are true, and it reminds me of a thread I read on Twitter that was about a nurse in one of the Carolinas. I can't remember if it's South or North. And she was talking about how her day to day is horrific because she gets screamed at by people coming in who have the coronavirus, and they're telling her that the coronavirus does not exist and they do not have it, and they're screaming at her. They're mad when she is trying to help her, or she's trying to help them, and then they're screaming until they get put into the ICU, and then they get put into the ICU and they get put whatever gets stuck down their throat, and they stop screaming. And she wrote about this on a Twitter thread, and it was like, that happens because of situations where we lose trust in what we're seeing, what we can believe in. And so I think it's a huge point, and a little bit of a tangent. Sorry, I just went off on that. But anyway, I wanted to talk a bit, jumping or switching gears a little bit. I think that what you look for in the future, what right now are you seeing that you think in a few years is going to be here, and in 5 years is going to be commonplace? What can you predict for us in your magic ball?
Well, I certainly see a lot of growth here, right? There's so much that excites me about the future of this space. I mean, there's increasing demand from all corners of business, government, civil society, academia, you name it. There's interest in this space. And I think that is really exciting. Um, I've had quite a few clients who come to us saying, look, we've got to do something. I don't know much about this space, but I can tell you, 80-90% of the people we've hired in the last 2, 3, 4 years are demanding that we do something. And so, one thing is that, millennials, Gen Z, you have power. You have a voice. Use it. Build a choir. Don't accept the status quo, and you can create change. And I think that is really encouraging to me, that where that demand is coming from and the responsiveness of quality leadership, or organizations with quality leadership, is really encouraging. And I think, what does success look like in the future? I have this vision that at some point there's going to be an interview of someone, maybe someone who starts work in a couple years, and in 5 or 10 years after that, they're being interviewed, and it's like, you've done this amazing stuff with ethics, and what makes you do it that way? And the confused look that comes back, and the response is, I don't know. It's always the way we've done it. And I think, to me, that is that's what success looks like, and that is really exciting to me.
So that's like laying the foundation so that there is no other choice.
That's right. This is
And
just the
so
way we do it.
yeah, exactly. So that there's not even a thought or an afterthought of doing it a different way. So how can you lay that foundation? I know you have a code of data ethics that you put out. What are some other things that we can do to try and make that more of a reality?
So we had put out a slight correction. We had put out like kind of a universal principles for data ethics, which are, the
Oh,
idea of those is that they would be adopted or used in the creation of codes that might be more context specific. But there's so much that we're doing to lay the groundwork, right? So wow, where do we start? So a number of years ago, in 2018, when I first started kind of going on the road show with talking with clients, what we heard was kind of a consistent um, um, theme, which was, I've been beating the drum at my organization for, X number of months or years. I finally have been anointed with the power to do something about it. It's an additional hat that I wear to my day job. And, I just don't even know where to start. And I have very limited time. I have very limited resources. What do I do? After hearing this a handful of times in probably a handful plus one meetings, we decided, let's set up something. Let's set up some kind of a salon where we can have practitioners in this space learn from each other and stand on each other's shoulders. And so that was the start in October of 18. We had the first meeting of the Data Ethics Salon series. And, I was kind of concerned, like, how are we going to find that many people, right? So I held it the same day. When I was leading Technology Vision, I had started an external advisory board there. And I said, okay, I'm going to hold it the afternoon after my advisory board meeting, because I know I can get some of those folks to stay after because they're interested in this. And that'll at least, put some butts in seats. And then, we'll get some other people to fill in some of the gaps. And, we had about 20 people at that meeting, and it was such a wonderful discussion. It went way long. We got drinks afterwards. You could do that back then. And it was a lot of fun. And almost everybody in that meeting said, hey, I know so-and-so and so-and-so at these other organizations, and they would love to participate in something like this. They're in the similar situation. And so I would say it turned into this thing that was basically a side project, and it got way too wieldy. So we talked with some nonprofits. We were actually going to spin it out as an independent nonprofit, but it turned out for a number of reasons that wasn't going to work out. So we talked to some nonprofits about making it a project of, and it just so happened that the Atlantic Council was spinning up a Geotech Center, which is kind of their first foray into global tech policy advisory and insight. You might know, the Atlantic Council are the good people who brought us NATO. And so they have a long rich history of global collaboration and whatnot. And so we ended up landing there. When we handed it over earlier this year, at the beginning of this year, there were nearly 200 members. So we had grown 10x in a year and change. And now there's way more than that, and they've leveraged their networks to add folks. And the idea there is that we really want to build a set of best practices, and so this is why we needed to spin it out. Right at Accenture, we're a global consulting firm with 500,000 people. If we want to publish something that is called a best practice, we need to train our global workforce in that before we do it. Otherwise, we're liable for not doing it. And so that kind of spurred the desire to spin it out. And so that is still the desire. I will say the pandemic threw a bit of a wrench in there. We had plans and strategies to have these convenings at global conferences. The first one was going to be South by Southwest.
Wow.
And so, we've pivoted, and I think we're still struggling on how do we get back to this vision of establishing best practices, because what we want to do is bring all of these practitioners together, and we have a number of kind of priority items. A good example is, what training programs work well for you? Are you willing to contribute those, in a brand agnostic way, right? So submit what you're doing. This organization will collect all of this information, will synthesize it, and will publish something stripping any provenance and basically publishing it under the brand of the Data Salon, and calling it a best practice. Because where we want to get to is this notion that there's insurable risk. And if courts can see that there is best practices established for an industry, then we can get to insurable risk. And this is basically just learning from cybersecurity and the path that they took, but it took them about 20 years to do it, and we're hoping to do it in a lot less.
Yeah.
So that's one item. Another item is, I'm working with a number of universities on kind of curriculum. And so what does that look like for, what kind of skills do we need this workforce to have? Some of the philosophers I work with, they joke that, oh my gosh, this is full employment for philosophers, right?
Job security.
Yeah, exactly. And so that, that's really interesting too. And I think, one of the other things is through the different networks that we're in, we really encourage, I took on 2 interns last year, right? Or this past summer. And so I really encourage remote. That was, those poor interns. And so, everyone who's in this space who has the ability to do that, please, start mentoring those that are younger. I also talk with folks on a weekly basis who reach out and basically, they're really interested in the space. They've got a portfolio of work, but they want to know how to get into it. There's a job board that I saw the other day that has a good list of these jobs. I'd say most of them are in academia, which is encouraging because we see that as a signal of this is where things start, and as those academic jobs get filled and get programmed, they're teaching others then to go out into the world and bring this stuff to them.
Yeah, that's awesome. We'll try and link to that job board in the description so that people can find it in case they're interested.
Awesome. I actually found it from the Slack group set up for Are You a Robot? So
there you go.
That's awesome. And we should plug that as well, because that's a very good community too.
Yeah, don't worry. I usually plug it at the beginning and at the end of every episode.
And in the middle. We'll do it. We'll do it in a number of places.
Like those middle commercials that you normally get in the podcast. It's like, yeah, get into that Slack community. There's a lot of good resources being shared there.
You need like a little box to display, it's a product.
Yeah. Product placement, or this podcast contains ads.
Right.
So anyway, this is a really interesting points that you're making. I think that one of them that's super interesting, and it touches on what a lot of the guests on here have been saying, is that it's like, we don't expect machine learning engineers to have ethics degrees, right? But we expect them to at least know a bit. And so that when things come, like when push comes to shove, they have the moral compass. And it's not like, who was it that said this just the other day to me on this episode? Somebody will tell me in the comments. On the other podcast, it was like, you look at this ethics not as a place that you're going to reach, but as a compass, and it's telling you which way is the direction that you want to go in. And so I thought that was brilliant, because it's like, oh, we're not going to just magically appear at some place where we go, okay, we're good on ethics. It's always going to be this conversation, and we're going to be driving it in one direction or another. And so that's an awesome points you're making there. I'm wondering, as you go in and you're talking to these people, because you went from getting 20 people in the room to over 200, and then you handed it off. And when you're going into these like Fortune 500 companies, are you having to make a compromise in the way that you're talking to them? Are you having to try and keep the interest of executives, or are they coming in there already like ready to eat up everything that you're saying?
It depends. I think so first off, when we go in and talk with businesses, we don't talk about this as you need ethics. We talk about this as, as a consequence of digital transformation, or of using, data to make decisions, or using data in products or services, et cetera. We talk about it as a function of risk. And so, what kind of risks are you exposed to now that you're making decisions in this way, now that you've deployed AIs in this way, et cetera? And that's a much different conversation than, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. I don't think any business leader is going to be, fully convinced on that argument alone. They are attracted to it because they know it is the right thing to do. They are attracted to it because they believe in some way this is going to improve the relationship they have with their stakeholders. And those might be partners, they might be customers. I'm working with WEF right now on a like B2B data sharing initiative. And it's, there's a lot of stakeholders in this chain, and they all have different cares. And I think that the thing that, one of the nice things that an organization like Accenture brings is kind of this exposure, this wide exposure. And so the ability to find kind of win-win-win situations is really abundant. And it's just a matter of really kind of finding those that are doing it for the right reasons, are interested for the right reasons. I mentioned the first phone call I got after the Cambridge Analytica scandal was from a general counsel. And I think, the comments that he made, and this was from a large Asian conglomerate, is basically, look, we're about to undergo these digital transformations for a number of our businesses so that they can compete.
Mm.
I realize that there are things in this transformation that can scale outside of our control. And I want to be sensitive to ethics as we do that. So what do we do? And I think that is a theme that is fairly consistent. And I think another part of that, the under, between the lines part of that, is a lot of, I would say 95% of those who reach out, they don't know what they don't know. They just know that this is something that they should pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And that's good to hear too. I mean, how you frame it as risk is also quite interesting because that will get people moving. I imagine that gets some energy behind it as opposed to, well, this is morally correct. And
It's also something boards care about because they're mandated to manage that risk.
Mm.
And so if one of the things where we've seen, really these programs can have success is where the C-suite and board are on board.
Yeah.
And
That
they're
makes sense.
supportive in driving that.
And you mentioned before about some, what did you call it? Insurance risk?
Insurable risk, yes.
Insurable risk. Can you break that down a bit?
Yeah, there's a good one of my collaborators, Scott David at University of Washington. He's a former lawyer who wrote a lot of the first privacy policies, and this was really a trajectory that he turned me on to, which was, look, there's a set of there's a pathway that we go through when we look at how do we get to insurable risk. And so what we look at is really this notion of, who is responsible for it, and how do they interact with others. So the chain that this goes through, that he can much more eloquently describe and get into, is really this notion that that we first have to establish a business's duty to handle data ethically. Then a governance body must be able to clearly demonstrate a breach of that duty. And if the breach directly causes quantifiable damages, a basis for liability can be asserted. An insurance company then underwrite that liability risk. And so once we can get to that, we don't need laws, because we have, basically courts will accept, what is it called? Customs as a source of law. So they will accept customs in an industry. That's a book I've read, by the way, that if you're ever tired, you should consider reading that as well. Maybe for lawyers, it's more exciting. But really this notion that customs of an industry or of a community, right? And if you really look at what is the provenance of law, it is really, what are the practices that communities undertake? And so if we can show that the business community goes through this practice, then we can establish that chain of duty, breach, causation, damages, liability, and insurance. And we don't need laws on the books for it because courts will uphold that practice.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's a way to bypass, it's like a loophole to not have to go through the slow process of regulation.
I like to think of it as more of a backdoor. It's hippies use the back door, right? Like let's not deal with all this friction. Let's just go to the back door.
Yeah. Well, and that is something that is absolutely incredible to dive into because we've talked about it here on the podcast quite a few times, especially with Heather when she was on, and she spoke about how this idea of, okay, innovation is happening at such a pace and it's so difficult to have regulation keep up with it, right? But what the main argument that you hear from those who are innovating is, or the main argument that you hear against regulation is that it will stifle innovation, right? And her argument was, well, what if we slow down just a little bit? Is it going to mean the end of the world? What if we actually do stifle innovation? What is that going to mean for society at large? What is it going to mean? Maybe it's better for us to slow things down a little bit. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that, first of all, and then let's start there before I confuse you with another question.
Yeah, regulation is a tough one. Hopefully we'll be able to publish a paper through the Atlantic Council next year that talks about some smart public policy initiatives. But I think that one of the risks that we have is broad policy around this stuff.
Yeah.
I do believe that leaders don't follow compliance frameworks; they set them. And so we do have an opportunity as an industry to show the path forward. I do also believe that engineers excel with boundary conditions, right? If you look at there's a good case study of NASA putting a satellite into orbit, and they took this market-based approach where they said, look, here's all of our ecosystem of vendors. At the end of the day, this satellite can only weigh this much, and the cost has to be below this, and we need it by this point in time. So all of you vendors have these three, basically chips that you can trade. And, I don't care what you guys do. You're going to get, what your contract says you're going to get. And then, you can trade amongst yourself for the rest. So if you need more space and you're willing to sacrifice, you can make it out of like a carbon, nanotubes or something that's ridiculously light, you can sell some of your weight that you're given to somebody else, right? And maybe they can exchange you some space for that, right? And this project came in under budget, under time, and a lighter spacecraft, right? So these forces can work, but it's about putting market incentives in the right place. So I think one of the kind of smart public policy, changes that we could make is to say, look, if you're an organization that is willing to identify and then report on these risks that you are taking, that you are undergoing, these digital risks, we're willing to give you, the SEC is willing to give you a ceiling on your liability for disclosure. Because that's the only way that we're all going to learn. And we might see that, an organization in life sciences, for instance, identifies a different set of risks than an organization in platforms or, name your other industry. So I think that is really an opportunity for us to kind of move forward. I don't look at it as, smart policy incentivizes innovation. It doesn't stifle it. But I think there are going to be some growing pains till we get there. A good example of this might be, surveillance policy, right? I live in San Francisco. We were the first city to pass the anti-face surveillance, regulation. And in my opinion, it's fairly nearsighted, right? First off, there's no law that deals with privacy that won't get passed, especially if it can go to voters, because voters will always vote for more privacy, right? And so those laws are not necessarily, they don't have to be well written. They don't have to be well crafted because they will get passed. And what we saw in San Francisco when it got passed, it was now illegal for any public employee to use unlock their iPhone because it used facial recognition. We saw that it was illegal for the police to do mugshot matching because it used facial recognition. But those were kind of the immediate things, and those have been dealt with. But as we look at that slippery slope, as we remove government, we elect a government to kind of take care of us, right? To be that big brother, if you will, that's going to look out for our best interests. And we empower them with certain privileges to do that. Surveillance might be one of those things, but it's definitely a slippery slope. But then the question to me says, okay, if governments can no longer do this, and this technology is being democratized to such a point that it can be used by anyone, where does that go? And my own like kind of thought experiment there is like, all right, what do I morally, intellectually just reject and find repugnant, but yet I would pay for? And so where that landed was basically a smart doorbell. I have two young children, they're 7 and 9. And I would pay to get a push notification if a convicted child abuser rang my doorbell. Maybe
Uh,
even if they walked by my house, right?
uh,
I'd pay a monthly fee for that. I want that security. I want to take care of my kids. But I find it repugnant that residents in a society would take on that responsibility.
and
And
now
and so
you're
that's the concern that I have, is like when we have policy that isn't really well thought out, well crafted, and really leads us to a more positive future, that we end up with things like that. And that's the last thing that we want, is citizens policing themselves,
yeah. Well, I mean,
or residents, I should say.
there's so many avenues I want to take on all of what you just said.
We could talk for days.
Yeah, it's incredible. I really appreciate that. I mean, the idea there though is that what's the alternative if you do have this? I don't see how the policy that San Francisco put into play has any effect with you having uh, that toy, or that, not a toy. I'm sorry, the facial recognition in your house to be able to realize if someone bad is knocking at the door.
The San Francisco policy prevents public sector from using, so San Francisco government agencies, right, and other municipalities that have enacted similar legislation. It is specific to those agencies. It is not, infringing upon rights of individuals.
But for you can still use it, right? Like, so whether or not they pass that
Right,
law that's poorly designed, you could still have it if you wanted.
I could.
And so, it is very scary to think about, because not only that, but the next thing that I was thinking about was that you're now going to be registering everyone that walks by your house. And somebody's got that data, and somebody's going to be having that. So that's another part where, and imagine you're not going to be the only citizen that has that. So now everybody who has the doorbell cameras or security cameras around their house, now they're implementing facial recognition. But what I didn't understand exactly about the law that San Francisco passed is, it's not possible for you as a citizen to do that, or it is still okay.
It
Like,
is
you could
still
put
okay.
a
The law from San Francisco is merely about government agencies.
Okay. Okay. So then, yeah, that is a bit of a scary thought, but it is probably already enacted in some of the new technology
Well, so
that's
we
been.
sort of see this already, right? In I don't want to name and shame anyone. So there's a smart doorbell manufacturer that has a social network around the doorbell, and we've already seen, a lot of basically, racist community comments around when dark skinned people walk by the house, or whatever that might be, and they're highlighting that as like, oh, this looks suspect, and it's like, oh no, that's Mike, he lives down the street, what's the problem here?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not the society that we live in today. And
Mm.
I think it's telling that we have these situations, and we keep kind of pushing that limit just a little bit more. We have neighborhood focused apps where that behavior happens, but it
Mhm.
happens in such small silos, echo chambers, if you will, that it doesn't see it more broadly. And I think that's really the concern, as we're getting into this where I can basically self-select my messages that I want to hear. And if I want to hear crazy, I will only see crazy.
Yeah.
um, that's the world we're in.
Wow. Wow. So incredible to think about that. And I really appreciate this thought experiment that you brought up. It's going to be one thing that I'm going to take home with me, or I am at home right now, so I'm going to take into the kitchen with me and I'm going to do this because that is something that I had never thought about. What is something that I absolutely feel disgusted by and think that is atrocious, but I would pay for, right? And what would those things be because of my security or because of my own mental well-being or mental peace of mind, I think. And so yeah, it's fascinating to think about that and that thought experiment. So I think we are hitting the time. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
I would love to know, Stephen, are you a robot?
I had a feeling you'd be asking me that. There's a fun book to read called "How to Survive a Robot Uprising," written by a CMU roboticist. I am not a robot, although I look to have more human-machine teaming in my life to make my life a little easier.
Nice. I really appreciate this conversation. It has blown open my mind on so many different levels. I really want to say thank you because I could, like you said, we could just continue talking for a few more hours. I want to be respectful of your time though, not keep you here. You got boards and Fortune 500 companies to go and counsel and make sure that they're doing the right thing. So I'll leave you to doing that. And I just want to say thanks.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. This is so much fun. I love talking about this. So wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, we may have to do a round two for all these questions that I had laid out that I did not get to. So be expecting a call from me in a few months.
Sounds wonderful.
Take care, Stephen.
Cheers, you too.